In a small town where everyone knows each other, Frank lives a quiet life alone. His garage has become his sanctuary, filled with tools and memories from decades past. One rainy night, a knock at his door changes everything. A tourist woman, stranded by a broken-down car, asks for a simple favor: to sleep in his garage until morning. Frank hasn't had a visitor in years, but something about her reminds him of kindness long forgotten. He agrees to help. When he wakes up the next day, she's gone. But what she left behind, a mysterious note and an unexpected gift, will lead Frank on a journey he never imagined possible. What could this stranger have possibly left that would change an old man's life forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Frank's morning began like every other morning for the past 20 years. At exactly 6:15 a.m., he shuffled to his kitchen in worn slippers, measured 3 scoops of coffee into his old percolator, and waited for the familiar gurgling sound that had become as much a part of his morning as breathing. The workshop calendar hanging on his refrigerator caught his eye. The same one he'd had since 1998, its pages yellow with age. He hadn't flipped it past March of that year. That was when Mary had left him, not by choice, but by the cruel hand of fate. The calendar's final visible page showed her neat handwriting, Dr. Apt 2:30. She never made it there. Steam rose from his coffee mug as he settled into his porch chair. The early October air had a bite to it, but Frank barely noticed. His eyes fixed on his garage across the short driveway, its weathered door a testament to decades of faithful service. Inside lay the tools of his former trade, each with its own story, each perfectly maintained and arranged in the same spots they'd occupied since he retired from carpentry 15 years ago. Mrs. Peterson from next door waved as she collected her morning paper. "Morning, Frank. Beautiful day ahead." He raised his mug in acknowledgement but didn't speak. That was their routine, her cheerful greeting, his silent response. She'd given up trying to engage him in conversation years ago, just like most folks. In town, after his coffee, Frank made his way to the garage. The door creaked open with a familiar protest. He could fix it, but the sound had become a comfort, like an old dog's morning groan. Inside, morning light filtered through the dusty windows, creating patterns on his workbench. The tools hung on their outline-marked spaces on the wall, a product of his need for order in a world that had proven itself too chaotic. He checked his watch. 7 a.m. exactly, time to begin the daily inspection. Starting from the left wall, Frank moved methodically through the space, examining each tool, wiping away invisible dust, adjusting positions by millimeters. The pegboard above his bench held chisels arranged by size, each handle worn smooth from years of use. Below them, hand planes sat in descending order, their brass fittings gleaming despite their retirement. At the back of the garage stood his pride, a restored Craftsman cabinet from 1945. Inside, organized in pristine condition, rested the fine tools he'd inherited from his father. He opened each drawer, touched each tool, closed each drawer. It was more ritual than necessity. The morning inspection complete, Frank settled onto his workbench stool. The clock on the wall, another artifact from his working days, showed 8:30, right on schedule. Through the window, he watched the town. Wake up! School buses rumbled past. Parents hurried children along the sidewalk, and the usual parade of morning regulars made their way to Martha's Diner, 2 blocks down. Time was when he'd been part of that parade, meeting his construction crew for breakfast before heading to the day's job site. Now he watched it all from his garage, like a sailor who'd found safe harbor, but sometimes missed the storm. The rest of his day would follow its own precise choreography. Lunch at noon. Always a sandwich, always at his workbench. Afternoon would find him tidying already pristine tools, or leafing through old woodworking magazines he'd memorized years ago. Sometimes he'd run his hands over rough lumber stored in the corner, projects he'd planned but never started. Mary had always encouraged his projects, even the ones that failed. As the afternoon sun cast longer shadows through his garage windows, Frank found himself doing what he did every day, existing in the space between memory and moment, surrounded by the tools of a life he no longer lived, in a garage that had become both sanctuary and prison. The workshop calendar watched over it all, its pages frozen in time, marking not just the day he lost Mary, but the day his world had shrunk to. The size of this garage. He knew every inch of this space, every tool, every shadow. What he didn't know was that tomorrow, all of this would change. The old radio crackled to life under Frank's touch, its brown plastic case warm with familiarity. He'd bought it the same year he opened his carpentry business, and like everything else in his garage, it had its designated spot on the workbench. The morning news buzzed through with increasing static, something about a major storm system moving in from the west. "Expect severe weather conditions throughout the evening hours," the announcer's voice fought through the interference. "All residents of Cedar County are advised to prepare for possible power outages and flooding. Several roads leading into town may become impassable." Frank glanced at his garage windows. The morning's clear skies had given way to a heavy grey ceiling, and the air held that peculiar stillness that often preceded significant weather. He'd seen enough storms in his 72 years to read their signs like old friends' faces. Outside, the town was responding to the warnings. The hardware store across the street had already sold out of flashlights and batteries, according to Mrs. Peterson, who'd stopped by his driveway, breaking their usual silent routine to share the news. The grocery store parking lot was full, and people hurried between their cars and the entrance, arms laden with supplies. Frank didn't need to join them. His garage held everything he might need: flashlights in the third drawer down, batteries in the metal box on the second shelf, even an old camp stove he'd kept from his younger days. Mary had always teased him about his preparedness, calling him her handyman boy scout. The radio continued its warnings throughout the day, each update more urgent than the last. Frank found himself listening more intently than usual. Typically, the radio served as background noise, a way to mark time as he went about his routine. But today, something felt different. The storm warning stirred something in him, a forgotten feeling of anticipation, perhaps even anxiety. By mid-afternoon, the wind had picked up considerably. It whistled through the small gaps in his garage door, creating an eerie harmony with the radio's static. The first few raindrops hit his windows, fat and heavy, like nature's warning shots. "Interstate 27 is now closed at mile marker 85, the radio crackled. "Multiple vehicles reported stranded. Emergency services are responding, but their resources are stretched thin. Citizens are urged to shelter in place and avoid all non-essential travel." Frank thought about the stranded travelers. 20 years ago, he would have hitched up his old truck and gone out to help. He'd done it plenty of times before, pulling cars from ditches, offering shelter to stranded families. Mary had always kept their spare room ready just in case, but that was before. Now his truck sat unused in the garage corner, covered with a tarp, another relic of his former life. The wind grew stronger, and the rain began in earnest. Through his garage windows, Frank watched trees bend and trash cans topple. The hardware store's sign across the street swung wildly on its hinges. Mr. Thompson, the owner, struggled to secure it as the storm intensified. Without thinking, Frank grabbed his tool belt and stepped outside. The rain hit him like cold needles, but his hands remembered their purpose. Together, he and Thompson secured the sign with practiced efficiency. When they finished, Thompson clapped him on the shoulder, the first human touch Frank had felt in months. "Thanks, Frank. Been a while since we've seen you in action." Frank nodded and retreated to his garage, soaked but somehow lighter. The radio was still broadcasting warnings, but now they mingled with reports of neighbors helping neighbors, of community coming together in the face of the storm. As evening approached, The storm reached its full strength. The garage's sturdy walls trembled with each thunderclap, and the radio's reception became increasingly sporadic. Frank lit his old kerosene lamp, its warm glow creating dancing shadows. Among his tools, the calendar on the wall fluttered with each gust that found its way inside, its pages seeming to want to turn forward at last. He settled into his workbench stool, prepared for a long night of listening to the storm and the radio's intermittent warnings. What he wasn't prepared for was the sound that would soon cut through the storm's chaos. A knock at his door that would change everything. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Frank stood frozen by his workbench, the kerosene lamp casting his shadow long against the garage wall. In 20 years, no one had ever knocked on his door this late, especially not during a storm. Like this, thunder crashed overhead as he made his way through his house to the front door. Through the rain-streaked glass, he could make out a figure huddled under the porch light. A woman, probably in her 40s, her coat pulled tight against the wind. Frank opened the door just enough to speak. "Yes, I'm so sorry to bother you," she said, her voice barely audible above the storm. "My car broke down about a mile back, and I've been walking looking for help. I saw your garage light." She pushed wet hair from her face, revealing kind eyes and an apologetic smile. "The motels are all full because of the storm. I don't suppose I could just sleep in your garage tonight, just until morning?" Frank's hand tightened on the doorknob. His first instinct was to say no, to close the door on this interruption to his carefully ordered world. But something in her expression reminded him of Mary, that same direct, honest gaze that had first caught his attention all those years ago. "Let me get my coat," he heard himself say. In the garage, Frank quickly cleared his workbench of tools, his hands moving with practiced efficiency despite his inner turmoil. The woman stood just inside the door, water pooling at her feet. "I'm Grace," she said, reaching into her coat pocket and pulling out a business card, now soggy and barely legible. She tried to hand it to him, but the wet paper fell apart in her fingers. "Oh, I'm sorry. I'm not usually this much of a mess." "Frank," he replied more curtly than he intended. He found an old chair in the corner, Mary's gardening chair. And pulled it out. "You can sit here. There's a space heater behind you." Grace settled into the chair, and Frank plugged in the heater. Its orange coils glowed to life, pushing back the garage's chill. Outside, the storm raged on, rain drumming against the roof like impatient fingers. "You're a carpenter?" she asked, looking around at the tools on the walls. Frank busied, himself arranging some old moving blankets into a makeshift bed on a clean section of floor. "Retired now. These tools are beautiful," Grace said, her eyes taking in the carefully organized workshop. "They remind me of my grandfather's shop. He taught me how to build my first birdhouse." Frank paused in his work. It had been years since anyone had shown genuine interest in his tools. "The planes on the wall were my father's," he found himself saying. "European beech. Don't make them like that anymore." Grace stood and walked to the wall, careful not to touch anything. "This one looks like his favorite," she said, pointing to a plane with a notably worn handle. "How did you know?" "The wear pattern on the grip, like it was an extension of his hand." She smiled. Grandpa's tools were the same way. Frank felt something shift inside him, like a rusty gear turning for the first time in years. He found himself reaching for the plane, taking it down from its outline on the wall. "Your grandfather was right about the grip," he said, demonstrating the proper hold. "Most people nowadays, they don't understand the importance of feeling the wood through the tool." They talked about woodworking for a while longer, the storm forgotten. Grace asked intelligent questions about his tools, and Frank found himself sharing stories he hadn't thought about in years. When he finally checked his watch, an hour had passed. "I should let you rest," he said, suddenly aware of how much he'd been talking. "Bathroom's through that door if you need it. I'll be in the house, lock's broken on the garage door, but nobody around here bothers with locks anyway." "Thank you, Frank," Grace said, settling onto the blankets. "Not just for the shelter, for sharing your stories too." Frank nodded and headed for the door. At the threshold he paused. "There's coffee in the morning, if you want it." Back in his house, Frank lay awake, listening to the storm. The wind had died down some, but rain still pattered against his windows. In the darkness, he could just make out the shape of Mary's photo on his bedside table. "What do you think of all this?" he whispered to it. For a moment, he could almost hear her laugh, could almost feel her nudging him to be kinder, to open up more, like she always had. In the garage, the lamp still burned, its light visible through his window. For the first time in years, his sanctuary held another person's presence. Strangely, he found he didn't mind as much as he would have expected. Sleep wouldn't come. Frank sat in his bedroom armchair, a worn photo album open in his lap. He hadn't looked at it in years, hadn't needed to. Every photograph was memorized, every moment preserved in his mind as clearly as the day they were captured. But tonight felt different. Tonight, there was a stranger sleeping in his garage, and memories he'd carefully packed away were spilling out like sawdust from an old wood joint. The album's first page showed his wedding day. Mary, radiant in her simple dress, standing in front of their first house. They'd bought it for a song because it needed work, but that hadn't mattered. He'd had his tools, she'd had her vision, and together they'd made it home. Thunder rumbled outside, softer now but persistent. Frank turned the page. Here was the day they'd opened his carpentry business. Mary stood proudly beside him under the hand-painted sign he'd made. Sullivan's custom woodwork, in careful letters, with her favorite roses carved into the corners. She'd insisted on the roses, saying every practical thing needed a touch of beauty. Another page, Mary in the garage, attempting to use his lathe. The piece of wood she was turning looked more like a twisted pretzel than the candlestick she'd intended, but her laugh had been worth the waste of good maple. She'd never been afraid to try, to fail, to make a mess. Unlike him, who'd spent the last 20 years keeping everything perfectly, sterilely in order. Lightning flickered, illuminating the next photograph. Their last Christmas together. He hadn't known it would be the last, of course. No one ever does. Mary sat surrounded by wrapped presents, wearing that ridiculous Santa hat she loved, while he pretended to be annoyed by her insistence on taking just one more picture. "You're being silly tonight, old man," he muttered to himself, but turned another page anyway. This one showed Mary teaching neighborhood kids how to build birdhouses in the garage. It had been her idea. "All these tools shouldn't just sit here looking pretty," she'd said. He'd grumbled about the mess, the noise, the liability, but secretly loved watching her share his craft with tiny, eager hands. A particularly loud thunderclap made him glance toward the garage. The lamp still glowed steadily through the rain. Was his visitor comfortable? The blankets he'd given her were old, but clean. Mary had always kept extras for emergencies, for strangers who might need help. "You never know when an angel might show up needing shelter," she used to say. Frank touched the last photograph in the album, Mary in her garden, just a week before the stroke. She was looking over her shoulder at the camera, her smile as bright as ever, dirt on her cheeks and flowers in her hands. She'd been planning to replant the whole garden that spring. "Time for a change," she'd said. "Everything needs shaking up now and then." He closed the album gently, running his hand over its worn cover. The leather was smooth from years of handling, though he hadn't touched it since moving it to the bedroom shelf after her funeral, keeping it close but closed, like his heart. Lightning flashed again, and in that brief, brilliant moment, Frank could have sworn he saw Mary's reflection in the window glass, smiling, that knowing smile of hers, the one that said she understood him better than he understood himself. "What are you trying to tell me?" he whispered to the darkness. The storm answered with distant thunder, and somewhere in the night a clock chimed midnight. In the garage the lamp flickered once, steadied, then continued its vigil. Frank sat in his chair until the first grey light of dawn began to seep into the sky, the photo album on his lap, like an anchor to a past he'd never quite learned to leave behind. Yet for the first time in years, he felt something stirring, a slight loosening of the rigid routine he'd built around himself like a fortress. Tomorrow would come soon enough, bringing whatever changes it might. For now, in these quiet hours, between midnight and morning, Frank let himself remember what it felt like to be the kind of man who opened his door to strangers, who wasn't afraid of a little mess, who knew how to help without measuring the cost. The kind of man Mary had loved. Dawn broke with unusual clarity after the storm, sunlight streaming through freshly washed air. Frank found himself at his front door earlier than usual, coffee pot forgotten, thoughts fixed on his garage and its overnight guest. But something was different. The garage door stood slightly ajar, moving gently in the morning breeze. His heart quickened as he crossed the driveway. Had she stolen anything? The thought brought immediate shame. After all, what was there to steal? Just old tools and older memories. The garage was empty. The blankets lay neatly folded on Mary's old chair, the space heater unplugged and returned to its corner. Everything was exactly where it should be, perhaps even more so. The floor had been swept. Then he saw it, propped against his father's old tool chest, a cream-colored envelope beside a package wrapped in brown paper and twine. His name was written on both, in elegant handwriting. Frank's hands trembled slightly as he picked up the envelope. The paper was thick, expensive, not the kind you'd find at the local drugstore. Inside was a single sheet of the same heavy stock, covered in that same flowing script. Dear Frank, thank you for sharing your sanctuary with me last night. In all my travels, I've rarely encountered such care hidden beneath such solitude. Your tools speak of a lifetime of creating beauty, but it's the stories behind them that truly matter, the ones you shared, and the many more I suspect you keep close to your heart. I noticed how your eyes lit up when you spoke about teaching. Others, the worn edges of that old workbench tell tales of projects past, of knowledge shared, of lives touched, but now it sits quiet, waiting. The gift I've left you isn't payment for your kindness. Kindness should flow freely, as yours did last night. Consider it instead a key to a door you once knew how to open. In 3 days, at 2 p.m., go to Martha's Diner. Ask for table 7. Someone will be waiting with the next piece of what could be, if you choose to build it. You're a maker, Frank. It's time to make something new. With gratitude, Grace P.S. Mary's roses were beautiful. Perhaps they could bloom again. Frank had to sit down. The last line about Mary's roses sent a jolt through him. He hadn't mentioned those to Grace. Had he? The events of the night felt suddenly dreamlike, yet the letter was solid in his hands. The package still waited, patient as time. He lifted it, surprised by its weight. The twine came away easily, and the brown paper unfolded to reveal a leather-bound, a book, not just any book, a teaching manual, its cover embossed with golden letters, traditional woodworking, a guide for mentors. Inside, the pages were filled with detailed lessons, teaching methodologies, safety guidelines. Between the pages, he found something else, a series of photographs, children in workshops, elderly craftsmen demonstrating techniques, communities, gathering around shared projects. Each photo captured a moment of connection, of knowledge passing from one generation to the next. Frank's hands ran over the book's cover, feeling its texture, the promise it held. 3 days. Martha's Diner. Table 7. The specificity of it nagged at him. Who would be waiting? What were they expecting? The thought of walking into the diner, of facing whoever might be there, made his chest tight. He looked around his garage, his sanctuary, Grace had called it. But in the fresh morning light, it looked different. Less like a sanctuary and more like what it had become, a beautifully maintained museum of what once was. The letter mentioned Mary's roses. Frank walked to the garage door and looked out at the empty flower beds that lined his driveway. 20 years of nothing but grass and weeds, 20 years of perfect order and absolute stillness. A morning breeze stirred the pages of the book in his hands. From somewhere down the street came the sound of children laughing on their way to school. The hardware store's sign, newly secured, caught the sunlight and gleamed. 3 days, a choice to make, a door to open or to keep closed. Frank placed the book carefully on his workbench beside the letter. Outside, the world went about its morning routine, but inside this space that had been his hiding place for so long, something had shifted. Like the air after the storm, everything felt somehow clearer, fresher, full of possibility. He touched the book's cover one more time, then turned to make his morning coffee. He had some thinking to do. 3 days passed like treacle. Frank found himself unable to focus on his usual routine, his eyes constantly drawn to the book and letter on his workbench. He'd read both so many times he could recite them from memory, yet they revealed no further clues about Grace or her purpose. At 1:15 p.m. on the third day, Frank stood before his bathroom mirror, adjusting a tie he hadn't worn since Mary's funeral. Behind him, reflected in the glass, lay an unfolded town map on his bed. Another relic from his active days. He'd found it in his truck's glove compartment, its creases deep and permanent, a coffee stain marking the intersection where his old workshop had stood. Martha's diner was circled in red. He didn't need the map. The diner was just 5 blocks away, but something about holding it made this feel more like a journey than an errand. The map had notes in Mary's handwriting along its margins, little reminders of deliveries made and customers visited. Mrs. Johnson, bedroom set, Miller House, check porch rails. At 1:30, he left his house, map folded in his pocket like a talisman. The September afternoon was warm, trees just beginning to hint at autumn. As he walked, neighbors noticed him, really noticed him, not just the usual polite nods. Mrs. Peterson actually stopped watering her flowers, mouth slightly open in surprise. "Frank, are you going somewhere?" "Martha's," he said, touching the map in his pocket. "Oh, well, isn't that nice?" She seemed to want to say more, but held back, as if afraid to break whatever spell had prompted this unprecedented event. The diner's neon sign buzzed into view. Frank checked his watch, 1:50. Through the windows he could see the lunch crowd thinning out. His feet slowed as he approached the door, its handle reflecting the afternoon sun like a challenge. The bell chimed as he entered, and the familiar scent of coffee and pie hit him like a physical force. How long had it been? The last time he'd eaten here, Bill Martha, old Martha's son, had still been running the place. Now Bill's daughter Annie managed it, though Frank only knew this from overheard conversations at the hardware store. "Well, I'll be damned," Ewy's voice said. Frank turned to find Annie herself staring at him, coffee pot frozen mid-pour. Frank Sullivan, in the flesh. "Table 7, he managed to say. Annie's surprise shifted to something else. Understanding. She nodded toward a corner booth. "Been reserved all morning. Coffee? Please." Frank slid into the booth, his back to the wall, taking in the unchanged interior. Same vinyl seats, same chrome trim, same rotating pie display. The map crinkled. In his pocket as he shifted, a coffee cup appeared before him, Annie's hand steady as she poured. "It's good to see you, Frank. Mum used to say your workshop crew kept this place in business way back when." Before he could respond, the bell chimed again. A young woman entered, maybe 30, dressed professionally, carrying a leather portfolio. Her eyes scanned the diner with purpose before landing on him. She smiled, and Frank felt his chest tighten. Something in that smile reminded him of Grace. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, approaching his table. "I'm Laura Chen from the Community Education Center. I believe we have an appointment." Frank glanced at his watch. 2 p.m. exactly. The map in his pocket suddenly felt heavier, like it was anchoring him to this moment, this choice. "Grace sent you?" Laura's smile widened. "In a way, may I?" She gestured to the empty seat. Frank nodded, and as she settled in, he noticed she had the same direct, honest gaze as Grace. Annie appeared with a second coffee cup and a knowing look before retreating. Laura opened her portfolio. "I understand you have quite a story to tell, Mr. Sullivan, and perhaps if you're willing, some valuable skills to share." The map rustled as Frank shifted in his seat, its old creases and Mary's handwritten notes a reminder of when his world had been larger, fuller. In his mind, he saw Grace's letter again. "You're a maker, Frank. It's time to make something new." He took a deep breath and a sip of coffee that tasted like memories and possibility. "Call me Frank," he said, "and maybe you should tell me what exactly Grace has in mind." Laura placed a stack of yellowed letters on the diner table, each one carefully preserved in clear, protective sleeves. Frank recognized the handwriting immediately, his own, from decades ago. "Where did you get these?" His coffee sat forgotten. It growing cold. "They were in our center's archives, letters you wrote to the old vocational school about taking on apprentices." Laura gently slid one across the table. "This one's from 1985. You offered to teach summer workshops for troubled youth." Frank's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the letter. The paper was thin with age, but the words were clear. "Every kid deserves a chance to build something with their own hands. It gives them pride, purpose. Sometimes that's all they need to find their way." "I never sent these," he said quietly. "Mary did." Laura's words hung in the air between them. "She believed in you even when you doubted yourself." Frank looked up sharply. "How do you know about Mary?" Laura opened her portfolio again and removed a photograph. It showed a much younger Mary standing in front of a building, her arm around a teenage girl with familiar features. "The girl in the photo is my mother. She was one of your first students." The world seemed to tilt slightly. Frank stared at the photograph, memories rushing back. Sarah Chen. She helped in the shop on weekends. His eyes met Laura's. "Your mother?" "Mom passed away last year," Laura said softly. "But she never forgot what you taught her. She became an industrial arts teacher, helped start our community education center." She paused, touching the photograph. "She also never forgot how you and Mary gave her a chance when no one else would." The letters seemed to whisper from the table, echoes of a man he used to be. Frank picked up another, dated 1987. "These kids don't need charity. They need someone to show them they're capable of excellence. Give me the ones nobody else wants. I'll teach them to build furniture and rebuild their lives." "There are more," Laura said, gesturing to the stack. 20 years of letters, ideas, proposals. Mary sent them all. She kept copies in a box that Mom found while helping organize. "The center's historical records." Frank's throat tightened. He'd written these letters late at night, sharing his dreams with the only person he thought would understand. But he'd always lost courage in the morning, tucking them away in his desk drawer. He'd never known Mary had found them, had believed in those dreams enough to send them out into the world. "The program you wanted to start," Laura continued. "Mom made it happen. There's a whole workshop at the center now named after her, but it needs someone with real experience to take it to the next level." She leaned forward. "That's why Grace contacted us." "Grace," Frank repeated. "Who is she really?" Laura smiled. "She's a talent scout in a way. She travels around looking for people with skills to share, connecting them with opportunities they might have missed. She saw your garage workshop, your tools, the care you take with everything. She saw what you could offer." More letters emerged. From the stack, responses to the ones Mary had sent, invitations to teach, requests for guidance. An entire conversation he'd never known was happening, orchestrated by the woman who had always seen the best in him. Annie appeared with fresh coffee. "More pie, Frank. You always used to love the apple." "Still do," he found himself saying. As Annie walked away, he noticed the diner was filling up again. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, catching the protective sleeves of the letters, making them glow like pages from a story he was just beginning to understand. "The center's having an open house next week," Laura said. "No pressure, but we'd love to show you what Mum built, what your letters inspired." She slid a business card across the table. Crisp, professional, nothing like Grace's rain-soaked one from that stormy night. Frank picked up the card, then gathered the letters with careful hands. Each one felt like a step on a path he'd almost taken once. a path that somehow still waited for him. "I'll think about it," he said, but they both knew he'd already made his decision the moment he'd walked into the diner. Outside, the September afternoon had mellowed into golden hour. Frank stood on the sidewalk, letters tucked safely in his jacket pocket, each one a piece of himself he'd almost forgotten. The walk home felt different. Not a retreat this time, but a journey towards something new. In his mind, he could hear Mary's laugh, could almost feel her hand slipping those letters into envelopes, sending his dreams out into the world to wait until he was ready to follow them. Frank spread the renovation plans across his workbench, their blue lines glowing in the afternoon light. Laura had dropped them off that morning, detailed drawings for transforming the community center's workshop space. His coffee sat untouched. Beside them, growing cold as he traced the familiar symbols and measurements with a weathered finger. The plans showed everything. Workbenches positioned for optimal instruction, storage solutions for tools and materials, even a special section designed for younger students. In the corner of each page, a familiar name caught his eye: Sarah Chen Design. These were more than just renovation plans. They were Sarah's vision, waiting for someone to bring it to life. "What do you think?" he asked the empty garage. His tools gleamed on their wall mounts, silent witnesses to his internal struggle. The teaching manual Grace had left still sat where he'd placed it, now accompanied by Sarah's old letters and photos. A knock at the garage door startled him. Annie from the diner stood there, holding a pie box. "Thought you might want this," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Apple, Dad's recipe. I didn't order. Consider it 20. Years of missed desserts." She set the box down and looked at the plans. "So it's true. You're thinking about teaching at the center." Frank sighed. "News travels fast." "Small town," Annie smiled. "Besides, you showing up at the diner was bigger news than the storm." She moved closer to the workbench, studying the blueprints. "Dad used to talk about your workshop classes, you know. Said watching you teach was like seeing someone come alive." Frank turned to adjust a perfectly aligned chisel, avoiding her gaze. "That was a long time ago." "Maybe, but that's still you in those old photos Sarah kept. Still your hands, that. Know every tool in this garage." She touched the corner of the plans. "Still your name these kids could learn from." The autumn breeze rustled the papers, and Frank weighted them down with his father's old wood plane. The plans showed ways to modify workbenches for students with different needs, storage solutions that would make tools accessible but safe, spaces designed for both instruction and inspiration. "I'd have to clean out the garage," he said quietly. "Some of these tools, they'd be better used there than hanging here." Annie's smile widened. "That sounds like a yes." "It's not that simple." "Why not?" Frank gestured around the garage. It's been a beautiful museum, Annie." "Finished. But museums are meant to be visited, aren't they? To teach people?" She moved toward the door, but paused. "You know what else Dad used to say? He said Mary would come in every morning while you were teaching, just to watch. Said she never saw you happier than when you were showing some kid how to bring something beautiful out of a piece of wood." After Annie left, Frank unfolded the renovation plans again. In the margin, in Sarah's neat handwriting, was a note he'd missed before. "Design inspired by Frank Sullivan's workshop, where I learned that creating something means believing in possibility." He looked around his garage, his sanctuary, his prison, seeing it through new eyes. The tools that had hung so precisely, so silently for 20 years. The workbench where he'd taught Sarah and others like her. The space that could hold more than memories. The plans showed room for 8 workstations, 8 chances to share what he knew, 8 opportunities to help someone build something lasting, 8 ways to honor Mary's belief in him and Sarah's legacy. Frank picked up his coffee cup, now completely cold, and walked to his kitchen to make a fresh pot. Through the window, he could see the empty flower beds where Mary's roses once bloomed. The renovation plans waited on his workbench, blue lines containing possibilities he'd locked away for 2 decades. He had a lot of work ahead if he was going to do this. Tools to sort, skills to refresh, courage to find. But for the first time in 20 years, the thought of change felt less like an ending and more like a beginning. The coffee maker gurgled. To life, its familiar sound somehow different today. Like everything else, it seemed to be asking a question. If not now, then when? The hardware store bell chimed as Frank pushed open the door, his father's tool catalogue tucked under his arm. Thompson looked up from his inventory clipboard, surprise flickering across his face. Twice in 1 month, Frank. Careful, or people will start thinking you're becoming social. His smile took any sting from the words. Frank unfolded Sarah's renovation plans on the counter. Need some supplies for the community center workshop. Thompson set down his clipboard, interest replacing. Surprise, so you're doing it, taking on Sarah's project. Someone has to get it right. Frank opened the catalogue to a marked page. Need 8 of these beginner's tool sets, made by Collins Brothers. They're not what they used to be, but still better than those imported ones. Collins Brothers went out of business 5 years ago, Frank. Oh, Frank stared at the catalogue, suddenly aware of how out of touch he'd become. Thompson gently closed the old catalogue. But I think I know what you're looking for. Wait here. He disappeared into the back room, returning with a glossy, modern catalogue. These are what Sarah used in her classes, designed specifically for teaching. The new tools were different. Ergonomic handles, safety features Frank had never seen. Before, modifications for various grip strengths and sizes. They looked nothing like his beloved antiques, but something about their purposeful design spoke to him. They're good, Thompson said, watching Frank study the pages. Different, but good, like most changes, I suppose. Frank nodded slowly. I'll need 8 sets, and some other things. He pulled out a carefully written list. Lumber, hardware, safety equipment. Thompson smiled as he read the list. This is quite an undertaking. It's what Mary would have wanted. Frank paused. What Sarah would have wanted too. As Thompson calculated the order, Frank wandered the aisles. The hardware store had changed since his contracting days. New products, new brands, new methods. But the essential things remained. The smell of wood and metal, the promise of creation, the possibility contained in each tool. A display of gardening. Supplies caught his eye. Rose bushes, the sign said, heavy with late-season blooms. Add these, Frank said, returning to the counter. 3 of them. Thompson raised an eyebrow, but added them to the order without comment. The total made Frank wince, more than he'd spent at once in 20 years. But when Thompson handed him the receipt, it felt like more than a purchase. It felt like a commitment. Delivery tomorrow morning, Thompson said. Need help unloading? Frank started to say no, his instinct for solitude kicking in. But he thought of the renovation plans, of Sarah's vision for a community space. Actually, yes, and maybe spread the word about the workshop program once. It's ready? Thompson's face broke into a genuine grin. Already done. My grandson's been asking about woodworking classes. Been telling him to wait for the best teacher in town to come out of retirement. Back in his garage, Frank began the task of sorting through 20 years of accumulated order. Each tool had to be evaluated. What to keep for teaching, what to relocate, what to let go. It was slow work, heavy with memory and meaning. The pegboard that had displayed his finest chisels would become a student tool checkout station. His sacred workbench would be joined by 7 others, arranged in a horseshoe pattern according to Sarah's plans. The space that had been his private refuge would open up, transform, become something new. As the afternoon light faded, Frank found himself holding his father's favorite plane, the one Grace had noticed that stormy night. Its well-worn handle still fit his grip perfectly, shaped by generations of use. He'd planned to keep it in its honored spot on the wall, but now he set it aside in a special box marked for teaching. Some tools were meant to be used, not displayed. Some knowledge was meant to be passed on, Outside, he could hear Thompson closing up the hardware store, the usual end-of-day routine. But tomorrow would bring something different. New tools, new purpose, new life to this space that had stood still for so long. Frank picked up his father's plane again, running his thumb along its smooth wooden body. "Time to go back to work," he whispered, and in the plane's worn surfaces he felt the approval of all those who had brought him to this moment. His father, Mary, Sarah, and even Grace, wherever she was. The roses would be planted tomorrow too, not in the old beds, but along the garage's outer wall, where students would see them as they arrived for class. Beauty and purpose together, just as Mary had always insisted they should be. The community center's bulletin board had been Laura's idea. "People need to see the progress," she'd said, pinning up the first photo of Frank's garage transformation. Now, 2 weeks later, the board was alive with updates, sign-up sheets, and notes of encouragement. Frank stood before it, coffee in hand, studying the latest editions. Someone had posted a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1985. His workshop's grand opening, Mary beaming beside him as he cut the ribbon. Beside it hung a fresh sign-up sheet for the first series of classes, already filled with names. "Quite a response," Laura said, appearing at his elbow with a stack of new flyers. "We've had to start a waiting list." Frank recognized names on the sheet. Thompson's grandson, Mrs. Peterson's nephew, children and grandchildren of people he'd known for decades, but hadn't really spoken to in years. "This one surprised me," Laura pointed to a name near the bottom. "Bill Martha's granddaughter. Annie says she's been saving her diner tips to pay for the course." "No charge for her," Frank said quietly. "Her grandfather gave me my first job when I came to town, taught me about business, about community." Laura smiled, pinning up a new photo. Frank and Thompson unloading the beginner tool sets, both laughing at some shared joke. Frank barely recognized himself in the image. "Mr. Reynolds from the lumberyard called," Laura said. "He wants to donate materials for the first project. Says he still has the bookshelf you helped him build 30 years ago." The bulletin board had become a timeline of awakening. Photos showed the garage's transformation. Old tools finding new homes, workbenches being assembled, safety equipment being installed. But more than that, they showed people coming together. Thompson bringing his truck to help move equipment, Annie delivering pies to the volunteers, Mrs. Peterson planting flowers around the new outdoor workspace. A child's drawing had appeared that morning, a crayon sketch of little figures around workbenches with Mr. Frank's wood class written in wobbly letters. The artist had signed it Tommy, age 8, and added a note. "My grandpa says you taught." "Him too." Frank touched the drawing gently. "I remember his grandfather. Joe Miller built his daughter a dollhouse in my weekend workshop. Carved tiny furniture for it too." "Joe's coming next week," Laura said. "Offered to help teach the seniors. Class says it's time to pass on what you taught him." The bulletin board had other offerings. Parents volunteering to organize materials, a local artist offering to help students decorate their finished projects, a retired nurse willing to be on hand during class hours. "It's not just a woodworking class anymore," Laura observed. "It's becoming what Mom always dreamed of, a place where craft brings people together." Frank nodded, thinking of Sarah's renovation plans, now nearly complete. She'd designed more than just a workshop. She'd designed a space for community to rebuild itself, one project at a time. The roses he'd planted had begun to bloom along the garage wall, their late-season flowers defying the autumn chill. Yesterday, he'd caught Mrs. Peterson carefully tending them during her morning walk. "Mary's variety," she'd said when she saw him watching. "I recognized them. She gave me cuttings years ago." She'd hesitated, then added, "I've kept them growing, in case you ever wanted them back." Now Frank pinned a new note to the bulletin board. Class start dates, tool requirements, safety rules. His hands, no longer trembling, moved with purpose. The familiar motion of hammering in the pushpins echoed the rhythms of his craft, a beat that had been silent for too long. "Oh, one more thing," Laura said, pulling an envelope from her pocket. "This came for you." The handwriting was immediately familiar. Grace's elegant script. Inside was a single line: "A maker never works alone." Frank looked again at the bulletin board, at the web of connections forming there. Each note, photo, and signature represented someone reaching out, someone remembering, someone hoping to build something new. The morning sun streamed through the center's windows, catching the fresh sawdust in the air from the nearly completed workshop. It smelled like possibility, like beginning, like home. The journal page fell from between the pages of Sarah's old project notebook, which Laura had brought over to help plan the first classes. Unlike Grace's elegant handwriting on her note and business card, this was written in a rushed, emotional scrawl. "Today I finally found him, Frank Sullivan. After all these years, he's exactly where Mom said he would be, in that garage she always talked about. The tools still hang in the same places she described. The workbench still has that nick in the corner from her first attempt at chisel work. I wasn't sure about this whole talent scout story," Grace suggested, "but it worked. He didn't recognize me. Why would he? I was just a baby when Mom brought me to his workshop that last time, but I saw it in his eyes when he talked about teaching. That spark Mom always described in her stories. Tomorrow I'll leave the note in the book. Laura's ready at the center with everything else. Mom's last project has to work. It has to." Frank read the words again, his coffee growing cold beside Sarah's notebook. "Laura," he said quietly. "Who wrote this?" Laura sat down across from him at his kitchen table. "Grace is Sarah's daughter." "My sister." The world seemed to tilt slightly. Frank's hands gripped the journal page. "But you said—" "I told you Mom passed away last year." "That's true, but I didn't tell you everything." Laura reached into her bag and pulled out a photograph. Sarah, older than Frank, remembered her sitting in a hospital bed. In her hands was a familiar book about teaching woodworking. "Mom got sick fast," Laura continued, "but she had one last wish: to restore your workshop program. She remembered everything you taught her, not just about woodworking, but about believing in people, about giving them chances. She made Grace and me promise we'd find a way." Frank stared at the photograph. Sarah looked so much like Mary in it. That same determined expression, that same belief in possibilities. "The storm that night," he said. "Grace's car breaking down." Laura smiled softly. "No broken car." Grace parked around the corner and waited for the worst of the storm. "Mom always said you couldn't resist helping someone in trouble. Said that's how she got her first job with you. Showing up on a rainy day, asking to sweep the workshop floor." The pieces fell into place. Grace's knowledge of his tools, her comment about Mary's roses, the way she seemed to know exactly what to say to wake something in him. "But why the deception?" he asked. "Why not just tell me? Mom said you'd closed yourself off after Mary died. Said direct approaches wouldn't work. You'd just retreat further into your garage. But if we could remind you of who you used to be, of the difference you used to make." She gestured around at the kitchen, where project plans and class schedules now covered the once empty walls. "Look what's happened in just a few weeks." Frank stood and walked to his window. Outside, the roses were blooming along the garage wall. 3 teenagers were setting up sawhorses in the new outdoor workspace, preparing for tomorrow's first class. "Grace is flying in next week," Laura said, "for the workshop opening. Mom would have loved to see this, you know. She never lost faith that her favorite teacher would come back to it someday." Frank touched the journal page again, feeling the urgency in those written words, the echo of Sarah's determination living on through her daughters. "Your mother," he said slowly, "she taught me more than she ever learned from me. About persistence, about believing in people even when they've stopped believing in themselves. She said the same thing about you." Laura stood to leave but paused at the door. "There's one more thing. That box of letters Mom found in the center's archives. She didn't find them, she kept them. Every one you wrote, every proposal Mary sent out. She knew someday they'd matter again." After Laura left, Frank sat for a long time with the journal page and the photograph. Outside, he could hear the teenagers laughing as they worked, their voices carrying the same enthusiasm he remembered from his teaching days. Sarah had known that he just needed a reminder of who he was, of what he could still offer. She'd passed that knowledge to her daughters, and they'd conspired to give him back his purpose, disguised as a stranger's kindness on a stormy night. Frank carefully placed the journal page in his father's old project notebook next to Mary's, pressed roses and the photograph of his first workshop class. Tomorrow there would be new students, new projects, new stories beginning. But tonight he had a letter to write to Grace. The storm hit without warning. Far worse than the night Grace had appeared. Frank stood in his driveway at dawn, staring at the damage while Thompson took photos for the insurance company. The massive oak tree that had stood beside the garage for 50 years now lay across its roof, its roots torn from the rain-softened ground. "It's bad, Frank," Thompson said, lowering his camera. "Roof's compromised, water damage inside." He showed Frank the photos on the digital display. Splintered beams, crushed walls, tools scattered like fallen soldiers. The roses along the wall were crushed, their late blooms scattered in the mud. Classes were supposed to start tomorrow, 20 students waiting to learn. Sarah's vision, Mary's legacy, all threatened by a single night's fury. "We'll reschedule," Laura said, arriving with Annie close behind. "Find another space temporarily." Frank barely heard them. He was looking at his father's tool chest, now partially crushed beneath a section of fallen roof. Water dripped onto the vintage chisels inside, each drop like a hammer on his resolve. "Maybe it's a sign," he said quietly. "Maybe some things are meant to stay in the past." "Frank Sullivan, don't you dare!" Annie's voice cut through his despair. She thrust a stack of papers into his hands, dozens of messages from the community. Bulletin board, gathered before the storm hit. A note from Joe Miller. "Teaching with you again will be the highlight of my retirement." A card from Thompson's grandson. "Can't wait to build something as beautiful as the cabinet you made for Grandpa." A letter from Mrs. Peterson. "Mary would be so proud to see the roses blooming again." "Look at these," Annie demanded. "Really look." More photos appeared, not of the damage, but of the work they'd all put in over the past weeks. The transformed space, the eager faces of future students, the community coming together. "My dad," Annie continued, "he used to say you could tell the true measure of a craftsman not by how his tools looked on the wall, but by how many people he taught to use them." Frank touched the broken door of his father's tool chest. Inside, despite the water damage, the tools still held their edge, still waited to be useful. "Thompson," he said slowly, "you still have that lumber order from Reynolds. Due this afternoon. Double it." Frank straightened up, years of builder's instinct taking over. "Laura, call everyone on the class list. Tell them there's been a change of plans." A change? Their first project. Frank looked at the destroyed garage with new eyes. "They're going to help rebuild this place. From the ground up, a real-world lesson in construction, in community." Laura's face broke into a smile. "I'll make the calls." By noon, people began arriving. Joe Miller brought his old carpentry crew. Thompson's grandson came with 5 friends from the high school wrestling team. Mrs. Peterson set up a refreshment station in her driveway. "We'll need to document this," Laura said, taking out her camera. "For the bulletin board." Frank nodded, watching as Thompson organized the volunteers into teams. The damaged tools were carefully recovered, laid out for restoration. The fallen tree was gradually cleared, each section of wood set aside. Good maple, worth saving, worth turning into something new. A familiar car pulled up, and Grace stepped out a day earlier than planned. She took in the scene, then walked to Frank with tears in her eyes. "Mom always said you did your best teaching when things went wrong," she said, "when students had to solve real problems." Frank looked at the growing crowd of volunteers, at the determined faces of his future students, at the roses that, despite being flattened, still clung to their wall. "Your mother taught me that sometimes things have to fall apart before they can be rebuilt better." He picked up a crushed rose, its petals still vibrant despite the damage. "Mary taught me that too. I just took a long time to remember." Grace squeezed his hand, then joined the work crew. The photos Laura took that day would tell a different story than Thompson's insurance documentation, not just of destruction, but of revival, of a community coming together to rebuild more than just a workshop. Frank rolled up his sleeves and picked up his father's hammer, its handle smooth with generations of use. "All right," he called out to his impromptu class. "First, lesson how to build something strong enough to last." The new blueprints covered Frank's kitchen table, weighted down by coffee cups and tool catalogues. They were different from Sarah's original renovation plans, bigger, bolder, born from necessity and inspiration. "See here," Frank explained to the group gathered around his table. "We'll extend the roof line, add clear-story windows for natural light. The fallen oak gives us enough lumber to panel the entire teaching area." Laura made notes while Grace sketched additional details. Thompson and Joe Miller debated the best way to incorporate the salvaged materials. Annie kept the coffee flowing, while her daughter, now the project's unofficial photographer, documented everything. "What about this space?" Joe pointed to a new addition. "Wasn't in the original plan." "Display area," Frank said. "For student projects. Mary always said craft deserved to be celebrated." He paused, then added softly, "Sarah, too." The blueprint showed more than just repairs. It revealed transformation. The crushed garage would become something greater, a proper workshop school with space for larger classes, a dedicated area for seniors teaching youngsters, and a small gallery where the community could share their creations. "Cost estimate?" Thompson asked. "Already covered," Grace said. "Mom's insurance policy." She left instructions, like she knew somehow this would be needed. Frank touched the blueprint's corner, where Sarah's original design stamp remained, now joined by the new date and his own signature. Together, they'd create something that honored both past and future. Outside, the cleanup crew had finished clearing the fallen tree. Mrs. Peterson's grandson, an arborist, carefully cut and labeled each usable section. The wood would season for future projects. The oak that had witnessed 50 years of solitude would now be shaped by new hands, turned into pieces that would live in homes throughout the community. "Ready for the next phase?" Laura asked. Frank nodded, rolling up the blueprints. They headed out to where the volunteers waited. His first class of students mixed with experienced craftspeople, all ready to learn and teach in equal measure. "Today's lesson," Frank announced, "is about foundations. Not just the physical ones we'll lay, but what they represent." He held up the blueprints. "This isn't just my workshop anymore, it's yours. All of yours." The work began with the energy of shared purpose. Thompson's grandson proved to have a natural eye for level lines. Mrs. Peterson's nephew discovered a talent for detailed joinery. Annie's daughter documented each step, creating a visual manual for future reference. By sunset, the foundation was marked and the first new posts were set. Frank stood back, watching as Grace taught Thompson's grandson the proper angle for bracework, using the same words Sarah had once used in this very spot. "You're smiling," Laura said, joining him. "First time I've seen that." "Just thinking about circles," Frank replied, "how they close, open, reshape themselves." The evening light caught the blueprint tube strapped to Laura's back, reminding him of how Mary used to carry her garden plans the same way. Some tools, some gestures, passed down without conscious thought. "We found something else in the cleanup," Laura said, pulling a small, mud-stained book from her pocket. "Mom's original workshop diary, her notes about learning from you." Frank opened it carefully. Sarah's young handwriting flowed across the pages. "Mr. Sullivan says every mistake is a chance to learn something new. Today I learned that broken things don't have to stay broken." A noise made them look up. Grace was ringing the old workshop. A bell, salvaged intact from the wreckage. The sound carried across the yard, calling everyone to end the day's work. "That bell," Frank said. "Mary bought it at a flea market, said every proper school needed one. As the volunteers gathered their tools, Frank saw it all with sudden clarity, the threads that connected each moment, each person. The blueprint wasn't just for a building, it was for a continuation. Every nail driven, every board placed, would be part of a story bigger than himself. Tomorrow, more volunteers would come. The walls would begin to rise. Within weeks, the new workshop would take shape, built by the very hands it would teach. The roses would be replanted, nurtured by those who remembered their significance. Frank rolled up the blueprints, their edges worn from the day's constant reference. They held more than measurements and angles now. They carried the weight of community, of legacy, of faith in what people could build together. "Same time tomorrow?" Grace asked, gathering her tools. "Earlier," Frank replied. Much to do. The sun set behind the half-cleared workshop site, painting the scene in shades of possibility. From destruction had come design, from loss had come legacy, from solitude had come solidarity. The blueprint tube stood in the corner of Frank's kitchen that night, a beacon of purpose. Tomorrow it would guide more than construction. It would continue guiding lives back together, one lesson at a time. The stack of thank you cards arrived on the morning of the workshop's reopening, carried in by Mrs. Peterson, who'd been collecting them from her mailbox. Apparently, everyone in town knew she talked to Frank daily now and could be trusted to deliver things. "People wanted you to have these before the ceremony," she said, placing them on his newly built desk. The wood was from the fallen oak, carved and polished by the very students who'd helped rebuild the workshop. Frank picked up the first card. The handwriting was shaky, old Joe Miller's. "You taught me to build a dollhouse for my daughter 40 years ago. Yesterday, I taught my granddaughter to build one in your new workshop. Some circles are meant to be completed." More cards spilled. "Uday Thompson's grandson, thanks for showing me that patience is as important as skill." Annie's daughter. "The photos I took of the rebuilding are now part of the town's historical record. You've built more than just a workshop." A soft knock interrupted his reading. Grace stood in the doorway, no longer the mysterious stranger from that stormy night, but a woman carrying her mother's smile and determination. "Ready for your speech?" she asked. Frank glanced at the cards. "Never been one for speeches. Mom said you used to talk for hours while teaching. Said she learned as much from your stories as your demonstrations." That was different, was it? Grace moved to the window, looking out at the gathered crowd. The new workshop gleamed in. The morning sun, its clear story windows catching the light just as Frank had envisioned. The roses, replanted and thriving, lined the walkway where people now gathered. "You know," Grace continued, "that night I came here, I was terrified. Mom's last project, her final wish. What if you'd turned me away? What if you'd rejected the whole idea?" Frank joined her at the window. Students, past and present, milled about below. Mrs. Peterson was arranging flowers. Thompson and his grandson were setting up chairs. Laura directed people to the refreshment tables Annie had arranged. "Your mother knew," Frank said quietly. "She knew I'd help a stranger in a storm, knew exactly how to remind me of who I used to be." "Who you still are," Grace corrected, pulling one last card from her pocket. "This one's from me." The card was simple, but inside Sarah's handwriting filled the pages. A letter she'd written before her death, entrusted to her daughter for this moment. "Dear Frank," it began, "if you're reading this, then Grace and Laura have succeeded in their mission. You've reopened your heart along with your workshop. Mom always said you were the kind of teacher who didn't just show people how to build things. You showed them how to believe in themselves." Frank's vision blurred. Outside, more people arrived. Students carrying projects, seniors ready to share their knowledge, children eager to learn. The new workshop hummed with possibility. "There's more," Grace said softly. "Turn it over." On the back, in Sarah's hand, "P.S. Mary would love what you've built. Not just the workshop, but the community around it. Some things are meant to grow, meant to be shared. You taught me that long ago. Now it's your turn to learn it again." The workshop bell rang, Mary's bell restored and rehung. People began taking their seats. Laura appeared in the doorway. "It's time," she said. Frank carefully placed Sarah's letter with the other cards. Each one represented a connection remade, a circle completed, a life touched by the simple act of sharing knowledge and belief. He looked around the rebuilt workshop, bigger now, filled with light and purpose. The tools hung ready on the walls, not as museum pieces but as instruments of creation. The workbenches waited for new projects, new stories, new beginnings. "Thank you," he said to Grace. "Both of you, all of you." She smiled. Sarah's smile, Mary's determination. "Ready to teach again?" Frank straightened his tie, touched the cards once more for luck, and nodded. It was time to open the doors, time to welcome the future, time to complete the circle that had begun with a stranger's knock on a stormy night. Outside, the roses bloomed, and the morning sun filled the workshop with possibility. The new workshop sign caught the morning light, its hand-carved letters deep and sure. Sullivan and Chen Community Workshop, where every hand builds tomorrow. Frank hadn't wanted his name on it, but Grace had insisted. "It's not about you," she'd said. "It's about the legacy you and Mom created together." Now, standing before the gathered crowd, Frank touched the small piece of paper in his pocket, his speech notes, though he knew he wouldn't need them. The story was written in every beam and board around him, in every face that looked back from the rows of chairs. 20 years ago, he began, his voice stronger than he'd expected, "I closed these doors. Thought I was just protecting tools, preserving memories, didn't realize I was locking away something far more valuable, the chance to make a difference in people's lives." The audience sat silent, attentive. In the front row, Mrs. Peterson dabbed at her eyes. Behind her, Thompson's grandson sat straight-backed, proud in his new workshop apron. But life has a way of sending us reminders of who we're meant to be. Sometimes they come as strangers on stormy nights. Sometimes as old letters kept safe by those who believed in us. Sometimes even as fallen trees that force us to rebuild more than just walls. Grace and Laura exchanged glances, their mother's vision finally realized. The new workshop stood as a testament to community spirit, larger, brighter, more welcoming than ever before. The clerestory windows filled the space with natural light, illuminating the carefully arranged tools and workstations. "Look around," Frank continued, gesturing to the walls. "Every tool here has a story. That lathe, Sarah Chen learned on it, then taught dozens more. Those handplanes, Joe Miller used them to build his daughter's dollhouse, and yesterday helped his granddaughter do the same." He moved to the central workbench, running his hand along its smooth surface. Oak from the fallen tree, transformed by many hands into something new and purposeful. But the real story isn't in the tools, it's in what we build together. It's in Thompson's grandson discovering he has a gift for joinery. It's in Mrs. Peterson teaching children how to tend the roses that Mary planted so long ago. It's in Annie's daughter documenting our journey so others can follow. The morning sun streamed through the clerestory windows, catching the brass fittings of the tools, making them glow like beacons. The roses outside swayed gently in the breeze, their fragrance drifting in through the open doors. This workshop was rebuilt by its first students, all of you. Every beam you helped raise, every board you helped lay, was a lesson in more than just construction. It was a lesson in community, in possibility, in the power of shared purpose. Frank reached beneath the workbench and lifted out a small wooden box, the first project he and Sarah had completed together all those years ago. Sarah Chen once told me that every piece of wood holds a story waiting to be revealed. She said our job as craftspeople isn't just to shape the wood, but to help others discover the stories they can create with their own hands. He opened the box, revealing a collection of small wooden roses, each carved by a different hand during the workshop's reconstruction. Today, we're not just opening a workshop. We're opening a new chapter in our community's story. These benches wait for your projects. These tools wait for your hands. These walls wait for your achievements to fill them. The workshop bell rang out, clear, bright, purposeful. Frank looked at the sign above the door, at the names joined there in perpetuity, at the legacy of teaching and learning that would continue in this space. "So let's begin," he said, reaching for his tools. "We have stories to build together." The applause was thunderous, but it quickly transformed into action as people moved to their workstations. The first official class was about to begin. Seniors teaching juniors, experience guiding enthusiasm, wisdom sharing space with wonder. Frank stood at his teaching station, watched Grace arrange tools for her group, saw Laura documenting everything. For the archive, the workshop hummed with energy and possibility. Above them all, the new sign caught the light, its carved letters deep and true, promising that here, in this place, every hand could indeed build tomorrow. The small package appeared on Frank's workbench one morning, 3 months after the workshop's opening. It was wrapped in familiar brown paper and twine, with Grace's elegant handwriting on the label. A final gift from Mom, to be opened when the time felt right. Frank sat at his bench, the early morning light streaming through the clear story windows. The workshop was quiet at this hour, waiting for the day's classes to begin. Around him, evidence of successful projects filled the walls, photographs of proud students with their completed works, shelves displaying the finest pieces, certificates of achievement. He unwrapped the package carefully. Inside was a handcrafted wooden box, its surface inlaid with a pattern he recognized immediately. The same rose design he'd carved on his original workshop sign, the one Mary had insisted on all those years ago. Inside the box lay a single key and a note in Sarah's handwriting. "Dear Frank, this key opened your workshop door the day you first hired me. I kept it all these years as a reminder that sometimes the most important things we build are the doors we open for others. Now it's time for it to come home. With eternal gratitude, Sarah." Frank held the key, feeling its familiar weight. He remembered the day he'd given it to Sarah, a young woman with determination in her eyes and a baby in her arms, asking for a chance to learn. The workshop door opened, and Laura entered with fresh coffee and the day's schedule. "Early class. Today," she said, "Thompson's grandson is teaching the seniors how to use the new lathe." Frank smiled at the role reversal. In just 3 months, some students had become teachers themselves, just as Sarah had once done. "Found something interesting in Mom's old files yesterday," Laura continued, setting down the coffee. "Her original application letter to you. She wrote it 7 times before getting the courage to bring it in." "She only needed 1 try," Frank said. "Had the same look in her eyes that Mary did when she told me to open the workshop in the first place." The morning sun caught the key in his hand, making it gleam. Laura noticed it and gasped softly. "Is that your mother's key?" "Grace just delivered it." Laura touched it gently. "She told us about this key, said it changed everything for her." The workshop began to fill with early arrivals. Mrs. Peterson came in with fresh roses for the vases. Thompson's grandson was already setting up his teaching station, arranging tools with the same precise care he'd learned from Frank. Annie's daughter arrived with her camera, documenting another day in the workshop's new life. The walls now held her photographs in chronological order, from the storm damage through the rebuilding and into the present. A visual history of renewal. "Got something for you too," Laura said, pulling out an envelope. Inside was a letter from the state's educational board. "They want to use our workshop as a model for other communities." Mom would have loved that. Frank placed Sarah's key in a small display case on his desk, next to Mary's old garden trowel and his father's first wood plane. 3 generations of faith in the future, linked by craftsmanship and care. The workshop bell rang. Still Mary's bell, its voice clear and bright. Students began taking their places, tools were distributed, the day's lessons prepared to begin. Frank looked around at what they'd all built together, not just a workshop, but a living legacy. Every surface held memories both old and new. Every tool told stories of both past and present. The roses bloomed outside in their newest garden, tended by many hands. He thought of that stormy night when Grace had knocked on his door, setting in motion everything that followed. She'd known, as Sarah had known, as Mary had always known, that some things just needed time and trust to grow. The key gleamed in its case, catching the morning light. No longer needed to unlock doors, but preserved as a reminder that every ending could be a beginning, if you just knew how to turn the right key. "Ready to start?" Laura asked, as the workshop hummed with activity. Frank nodded, picking up his teaching apron. Around him, the air filled with the scent of wood and roses, of coffee and possibility, of stories waiting to be built. "Always ready," he said. "Let's begin." A year to the day after that stormy night, Frank stood in his driveway, watching the morning sun illuminate the open workshop doors. The garage that had once been his solitary sanctuary now buzzed with life, even at this early hour. Thompson's grandson was setting up for his advanced woodworking class, while Mrs. Peterson arranged fresh roses from the flourishing garden in vases throughout the space. The workshop had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What started as a local teaching space had become a model for community craft centers across the state. Laura handled the administrative work, coordinating with other towns looking to start similar programs. Grace visited monthly, each time bringing new ideas and techniques from her travels. The original sign still hung proudly: Sullivan and Chen Community Workshop, where every hand builds tomorrow. Below it, a display case held cherished artifacts: Sarah's key, Mary's garden trowel, the rain-soaked business card from that fateful night, and a piece of the fallen oak transformed into a small carved rose. Frank's morning routine had changed. Instead of solitary coffee and silence, he shared breakfast with his students in Martha's diner. Annie had reserved table 7 permanently. For the woodworkers, the small plaque read, "Stories and laughter flowed as freely as the coffee." Today was special. The workshop was hosting its first graduation ceremony. 12 seniors had completed the year-long Master Craftsman program, each now qualified to teach others. Among them was Thompson's grandson, who had discovered not just skill with wood, but a gift for inspiring others. The roses bloomed fuller than ever, tended by many hands. Mary's garden had expanded, wrapping around the workshop like a living embrace. Students often sat among the flowers during breaks, sketching designs or simply finding peace in their beauty. Frank touched the workshop door, still bearing that familiar creak he'd never fixed. Some things were worth keeping, like the memories wrapped in every sound and shadow of this place. But now those memories had company: the laughter of children, learning to build their first birdhouses, the pride of seniors mastering new skills, the quiet satisfaction of creating something lasting. Inside his office, a new letter waited from Grace. "Mom would be so proud of what this has become, not just a workshop, but a home for second chances and new beginnings." The morning bell rang, Mary's bell, still calling people to create, to learn, to share. Frank put on his teaching apron, the one his newest students had made him, embroidered with a single rose and the words, "Every hand builds tomorrow." Outside, cars were already pulling up. Another day of teaching and learning was about to begin. But now, when Frank looked at his tools on the wall, he didn't see relics of the past. He saw instruments of possibility, waiting to shape not just wood, but lives. The garage door stood wide open to the morning sun, never to be closed again.